Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today 4 official supporters of the Let Us Pray campaign and people who will be known to many of you. We've got the Revd Calvin Robinson. He's a deacon of the Free Church of England. I'm sure he would say that's the most important thing you need to know about him. He is also a GB News presenter and a political commentator. We've also got Dr. Julie Maxwell. She is a community paediatrician. She's a General Synod member. She's a youth worker at St Mary's Basingstoke. She's also employed by Lovewise and a trustee of Family Education Trust. So how she's had time to join us today, I've got no idea. But that's Julie Maxwell. We've got the Revd Matthew Roberts. He is the minister of Trinity Church in York, and he is the former moderator of the International Presbyterian Church and one of the founders, along with Julie, of the Greater Love Declaration. And then we've got Dr. Stuart Waiton. He's a senior lecturer in sociology and criminology at Abertay University and a commentator. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Can I say genuinely, it's an honour to have you speaking with us today. It's an honour to have you as part of the Let's Pray campaign. You are all people who are known for being courageous and wise in the public square, and that's a rare combination. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us this morning. So there's a lot of confusion about the term conversion therapy. What do you think it means? And most importantly, what do you think those calling for a conversion therapy ban mean by it? Matthew Roberts, I wonder if you would like to go first on that.
Thank you very much, Simon. Pleasure to be with you. I think exactly the issue here is that what it means is slippery. And what is meant by it when people are arguing for why it should be banned is not the same thing that is meant by it when actual concrete proposals are put forward for what should be banned. And that's really the key thing. It's functioning as a sort of Trojan horse. We all are aware, I'm sure, that in the past, actually, it's originally a Victorian 19th century invention, and certainly not a Christian one, was the idea that homosexuality was a disease that could be cured. And that idea led to an awful lot of very unpleasant and I think we can be a lot stronger than that, really, pretty evil ways in which people were treated. I mean, treated is the wrong word, really. It was a pretty abusive kind of thing of either medical interventions, supposedly with hormones and things, or supposedly sorts of psychotherapy and aversion therapy and things which were used and very widely, and certainly this wasn't particularly a Christian thing at all. But back in the 1950s and 60s, that would have been pretty common. It certainly is true that sadly not all Christians are as critical about these things as they should be, and so there were some Christians who kind of got on that bandwagon as that was going on. But the very good thing about that is long in the past. Recent requests, freedom of information requests to police forces and others in Britain have found no evidence that anything like this has happened now anywhere in the recent past, and certainly is not happening at present. There have been no prosecutions for these things, even though the government is quite clear that they are fully illegal already, and it's years now since anyone has been prosecuted for it. And so that's very good. That's very good news. Now, the problem is that whenever people talk about banning conversion therapy, those are the things that are talked about, and it's pretty common. For example, those we've brought out. We've had quite a lot of BBC articles and other outlets that tell stories about these things that happened in the past and how terrible they were, but they are illegal. But the actual proposals that campaigners now want to ban, that are sort of for the things they now want to ban, are not that, because that's already illegal. What is meant instead is, particularly, it's because of the word conversion, which is a Christian word. The thing that now campaigners want to ban is simply anyone saying that that people should live according to, well, straightforwardly, Christian morality, which is that we shouldn't fulfill our sexual desires, we should deny them for the good of others, for the honour of God, and we should constrain sexual activity to the marriage of one man and one woman. That's what Christianity has always said. But that is very specifically what campaigners want to ban. But it's not at all what the rhetoric says they want to ban, and that is the issue.
Calvin, what's your take on what people mean when they say they want to ban conversion therapy?
I fall very much in line with what Matthew Roberts has just said, in that electrocution, corrective rape, medication are already outlawed and they're not common practice anywhere. So these aren't the issues that people are campaigning against truly, even if they paint it as that way to get public support. What people are campaigning against when they talk about conversion therapy is prayer and therapy. And we're talking about outlawing conversations between parent and child, and outlawing conversations between person and pastor. It will be illegal under the premise of this legislation to have a conversation with someone about their sexuality, because it could be perceived as a conversion therapy. The idea that if someone's struggling with fornication, adultery, sodomy, if someone is struggling with sin and they want to have a conversation with their vicar, with their priest, with their pastor, with their minister, that person would be treading on very dangerous ground in even engaging in that conversation. Likewise, if someone's not Christian and they want to go and see a therapist about their sexual desires, that therapist would be very averse to a conversation around it. And I think that's on purpose. And Matthew mentioned, conversion is a Christian word. I don't think it's by accident that they've used the word conversion in the conversion therapy ban, just as the Pride celebrations use the word pride. This is all about denigrating the Christian faith and celebrating sin. That's what a lot of this is about.
Julie, what do you think the impact of this kind of ban could be on parents?
I think it is particularly worrying in that this kind of whole misunderstanding of what conversion therapy is, and the sort of the confusion about what it is likely to lead parents to just worry about any kind of conversations with their children. And of course, we've worked really, really hard to try and encourage parents to talk about sex, to talk about relationships, to kind of have these really open conversations, whether that be Christians or anybody really. But actually this proposed ban is likely to make people concerned to talk about anything like this. And then you've got children who are not being protected, who are not being guided. As parents, we spend our time guiding our children as to what's best for them, whether it be around sleep, eating, what they watch on telly. And actually, sex and relationships is one of the most important conversations parents need to have with their children. And if they're afraid to do that because they're afraid of being labelled or accused of conversion therapy, then that is a really, really worrying situation.
Stuart, so you don't come at this from a religious point of view. Is it the impact on parents and children that primarily concerns you? What is it why do you feel so strongly that an overbroad conversion therapy ban is just a bad idea?
I've said this about almost every bill that the Scottish government's brought out for about the last 15 years, but this, to me, is the most dangerous, damaging, authoritarian piece of legislation that I have ever come across. And as people have said, it is essentially making conversations illegal that you don't like. I can see what people are saying in terms of what conversion therapy is understood as in the extreme, but I think the battle's more difficult than that, which is that I think if you just said today that having these conversations should be allowed, there'd be quite a few people that would question that, because the situation we're in, as far as I can understand it, is that the modern self, the way it's understood, is that you have this authentic self which comes from inside, right? So if you read the latest advisory group discussion on this, they talk about the innate nature of yourself. And that's where we are in terms of modern society, is that we are talking about the authentic self. And it's all about, you need to be you, be the real you. And if you understand the self as purely coming from inside, anything that comes from outside is then oppressive. So what we used to call socialization becomes a form of oppression. And that's where we are. So that's, and so this, the inner innate self, also, I think that's why the sort of sexuality dimension is important, because your sexual urges and the way you think about yourself does appear absolutely to come from inside yourself. So what happens then is that individual who faces alternative ideas or a questioning of this inner self is that then perceives this as a form of oppression. And that's the way it's being represented. So it is literally the case that we are now in a situation that other people's beliefs and thoughts and conversations with either their child or between two adults is to be criminalized. And the reason it's so horrifying is that it's essentially the destruction of the idea of the human subject as the individual who has responsibility for themselves, because adults are not allowed to have these conversations either. You know, it's presumed that any conversation is a form of oppression. That's between two adults, right? I mean, the children thing might be an argument where people can say children are not adults and so on. But here you're talking about a gay man, for example, at the age of 30 goes up to a preacher or anybody else, or even their parents possibly at that age, and says, I'm gay, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm not sure. And that person says, well, I think whatever, expresses their opinion, then that's a criminal offense. You know, literally just having a conversation. And even if that person wants that conversation, it's still a criminal offense because it's perceived that they can't possibly go against their innate, inner, authentic selves. So it's a complete destruction of basic legal principles, of the idea of the responsible individual, of the idea of the subject, of parents having a right to have beliefs which they want to kind of instill in their children. I mean, it's astonishing. I'm amazed there's not more of a reaction to this, but that's partly, I think, because this modern idea of the authentic self and that the role of the elites is to protect that self. I mean, I'll stop in a second, but the driving force for this, I think, is that the modern elites, this is their new form of moral crutch. Like, they see their role as protecting this vulnerable, atomized individual. And that's where they get a sense of moral purpose, is through this kind of protective legislation. So yeah, I think it's the most horribly dangerous authoritarian piece of legislation by a country mile.
Matthew, I wonder if you want to come in on this issue of why people want this kind of blasphemy law to stop you saying things they don't like. Because I mean, I've heard you on this even recently. Stuart's analysis is surprisingly close to your own, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's very, very helpful. I mean, there's a huge irony here, isn't there, in that in a sense, it's trying to, this authentic self is all about the subject is all there is. And yet, as Stuart says, actually, you can't do that, because what it does effectively is to delete other people's agency, but just as strongly as they think their own is. But I think the thing that's particularly interesting about this is that issue of, is the self to be primary, or is something else to come and kind of overturn the self? That is what Christianity is about. Like, Jesus' central command to people is deny yourself, take up your cross and follow him. And so when this is presented as being, well, it's just a basic moral issue, it's innate. The UK government actually put that in their consultation last year. The government's view is that these things are an innate aspect of personhood. And we pointed out, it's just like, yeah, but Christianity itself denies that. If you make that a legal principle, you are making the very core of the Christian gospel illegal, which is that, yeah, our self is the problem. Our self is that we have placed ourselves in the place of God. The self is not God. God is God, and what he's done in Christ is come to us to call us back to him and to tell us to turn away from ourselves and to him. So Stuart's analysis, I think, is very, very helpful. And that just points out why the Christian church just cannot be willing to go along with this, because this is very deliberately an attempt to say, the thing that Christ calls men, women, and children to do is something which will be made illegal. It's the most direct attack on Christian preaching and teaching and conversations that I think we've seen in this country for a very, very long time.
So Calvin and Julie, I want to ask you to talk for us specifically about the ordinary work of churches, how this is going to pan out. We've touched on it, but just, Calvin, if you would go first, just talk us through a kind of real-world scenario of how you think a conversion therapy ban of the kind we're talking about could affect your ministry in your church.
Right. So I've been talking a lot about the issue of gay marriage recently because it's been cropping up in the state church. And the Christian perspective is obviously that marriage in a Christian context is monogamous and heterosexual. It's one man, one woman. And that's been considered a norm for, 2,000 years of Christianity, but 4,000 to 6,000 years of Judeo-Christian values too. And that topic alone is blasphemous to this new heterodoxy. And what I mean by that is there are many people saying that we should be accepting of people's sin, and we should be accepting of people that want to live different alternative lifestyles. And there's nothing wrong with two men getting married, for example, because love is love. And so the Christian argument against that, which I made a few times, was, well, first of all, love is not love. That's a very vague term that you can't define a word by its word. But secondly, just me saying that we shouldn't be accepting of sin because Christ sat with sinners, but they went away changed, not Christ, and that we're all called to repent from our sin, and that we are all sinners, which is a basic understanding that people seem to have forgotten. It's not like we're pointing at people saying, you're a sinner, as if it's a derogatory thing. We are all sinners, we acknowledge that. But just acknowledging those points, people responded to my statement saying that is conversion therapy, therefore trying to shut down the Christian perspective. And I think, actually, Matthew's on the money with a lot of this without using the word itself, but this is idolatry, is what it all comes down to. Putting the self before God, putting the self as a God.
Julie, what about your youth ministry? How can you envisage this cutting across the kind of stuff that you do at your church?
Yeah, I think it's hugely worrying. I mean, just sort of picking up on some of the, what Stuart was saying, is that, our children and our young people are growing up in this culture where they are being told that the most important thing is that they need to be themselves, and that if they try hard enough, they can be whatever they want to be, and and all of this kind of thing. That is a huge pressure on young people, particularly, and we're seeing that in lots of the mental health problems that we're seeing young people. And how can we support young people and talk to young people and help them to kind of navigate through this whole huge pressure of, well, who am I? How do I know who I am? How can I discover who I am if we're not allowed to talk to them about it? So it's sort of, not just the whole sexuality and gender issues, but just the whole issue of who I am. But obviously for young people at the moment, the sexuality and gender is the kind of defining part of who they are according to society. And so if we're not allowed to talk to them about it, what can we talk to them about? How can we support them as they seek to live for Jesus, as they seek to live full stop, whether this be the Christian children in our young people or those that are just coming along and, wanting some help with whatever is going on in their lives. It's going to make youth leaders and parents terrified to talk about this stuff. And it's going to make the young people themselves afraid to talk about things because they're not going to want their youth leaders and their parents to be accused of conversion therapy. So they're going to be afraid to talk about those very things that they absolutely need to talk about and they need support with and they need guidance with.
Stuart, you touched on the challenges of persuading people on this issue, and I wonder if you want to say something about that. That concerns me a lot. That's a big focus for me. How do we help people to understand, what we do and don't mean when we say we're concerned about this? How do we persuade people who aren't necessarily coming from our starting point that we've got valid concerns here?
For a lot of people, Christianity is not really part of their kind of remit, and also Christianity is seen as being homophobic. Which I think there's a fair argument that you could say because Christianity is not cool or keen on homosexuality. That doesn't fit with the modern zeitgeist. I mean, I'm completely into gay rights and so on, so that doesn't fit me, and I'm still absolutely horrified about this. I think I think one of the things at a general level is that most people, I think, understand that what makes an individual is not just an individual, but we are both individuals and we're social. And if this bill goes through, it is criminalizing socialization. It is criminalizing people trying to express their beliefs. And you have to then say to people, well, okay, so do you essentially think that Christianity should be a crime? You know, if you cannot express your beliefs, then you're essentially criminalizing religious belief. Not just religious beliefs, actually. It could be just parents who don't like the idea of their child having a certain sexuality, or the whole transgender question. I mean, I think if this goes through, you could have huge demonstrations if this goes through. The idea that a parent cannot question their child saying that they are transgender, right? I mean, I can't believe they're going to pass it. You know, I just can't believe that aspect of it. I think they might feel more comfortable with the homosexuality question. But if they pass this in the way that they're presenting it, so that a parent just questioning their child a girl who says they're a boy, and that is a crime, I cannot comprehend that can go through. Even in Scotland, which is mad. But of course, that's part of the problem. We now have we have this complete divide in society. We have this expert class who run the world, and the rest of society. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the problems with this, because we are both individuals and social, if what we are doing in society is saying to all young people, essentially, you are you, then you're creating a situation where the identities that people develop are incredibly fragile. They're deracinated, I think is the word, in terms of they are being wrenched away from any values outside themselves. Right? And it's not just about Christian values. This is about parents' values, any traditional values, any community values, anything external to the self is being seen as a danger and a threat. And what you end up with is incredibly fragile human beings, right? Because an identity, to be anything of worth in a society, must be related to other people, must be related to other forms of meaning, how you understand yourself in terms of other people and so on. And what you end up with is what I'd describe as a kind of new dependency culture, because these fragile individuals constantly crave recognition. And the state now has taken on the role of recognizing that individual. You need to valorize. It's not enough for them to just have their own identity. You must valorize that identity. You must constantly give praise and recognition to that person because they are so fragile. So you end up this terrible, desperate situation where you have they are encouraging a generation of fragile selves, which they then come along, and it becomes their role then to sort of pat them on the head and give them a hug and say, you know, yes, we recognize you and so on. And that's the one driving thing that does worry me, that this might actually happen. That does seem to be the new kind of moral framework of the modern elites, of taking this role of protecting the vulnerable. So I think at one level it's difficult, but at the level of the transgender question, I think they'll have to drop it, because I think if that goes through, the implications at the basic level that you can't say to your child, actually, you're a boy or you're a girl. Yeah, it's I just can't see them doing it. It's such a huge step, and I think if they do that, we've got a real chance of making something happen with parents.
I'm not as optimistic as you, Stuart. I do think this will go through. And I liked when you said, you know, they might as well just say, let's ban Christianity. But I don't think that question would scandalize them. I think a lot of people would say, oh, yes, of course we should ban Christianity. It's so out of date in 2022. This is the fundamental problem, isn't it?
And Calvin, if we have these fixed yet fragile children's identities, it excludes any opportunity for learning, for change, for growth, and in Christian terms, repentance, right?
Oh, absolutely. But of course, it's all part of the same movement. If I'm being honest, it all comes down to neo-Marxism is what it does. It's breaking down the family, breaking down family values, and breaking down Western society. And to do that is destroy the family and destroy the Christian faith, because the Western society is built on the Christian faith. And they're being very successful in what's being done. So it's not just this piece of legislation, it's in the way that children are taught in schools now about, and it's always passed off as an appropriate or a good or a nice thing to be more inclusive. But we're teaching children all the way down to the age of 5 about alternative lifestyles, and not just about different types of parents, as in two men and 2 women, but about what those parents might get up to in their private bedroom. And we're going way too far on age appropriateness and forgetting safeguarding, all in the name of inclusivity.
Yeah, Julie, I mean, that's very much a theme that you were concerned about. Again, I've heard you speak to that. I mean, that's right, isn't it? That's one of the risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just seems like in a society where we're supposedly obsessed with safeguarding, and there's all sorts of safeguarding scandals and all the rest of it, all of this stuff that, that's being taught to children just flies in the face of safeguarding. All of the things that Calvin was just talking about, the stuff that's being taught in schools, and in particular this idea, on the whole idea of sex is, that you can do whatever you want so long as you're consenting, and that you can pretty much consent at any age, so long as you understand whatever that means, and actually all sorts of extreme things are being normalized in the guise of being inclusive, and of kind of not stopping people expressing their individuality, in whatever way that might be, and it's just ridiculous, because we all know that children need protecting. We know that they need protecting from themselves as much as anything. Up until 25, they are not. Their decision making is not fully developed, and they don't make decisions based on consequences, and we all know that. And for very young children, that's kind of easy because they're in your house and you can kind of determine what they do. But as they get older, they're more susceptible to what's being told around them. And as parents, we need to guide them. We tell them that taking drugs is a bad idea. They might go ahead and do it, but we tell them it's a bad idea. We tell them that they need sleep, that they need all of these things. So why can't we tell them what's best for them? In the case of relationships and and identity, and particularly the whole transgender thing. We're allowing them to make decisions about their future, which will end up with them being medical patients potentially for the rest of their lives. And that is that it's outrageous.
So sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing at a straightforward level that you can question about this is this idea that it's innate, because I mean, just at a practical level, people know that there are lots of kids at school now. So I talked to my daughter, right, who's 21 now, so not that long out of school. But she would say at school that, there's all these different types of kids, the emo kids and so on, who would say that they're bisexual and they're this sexual and they're that sexual and so on. And these are just teenagers and young people who are part of this culture. And a lot of people realize that. And so the idea that you can't question, sort of 13, 14-year-old who's kind of, engaged in this kind of gender discussion, and that somehow this is innate, that this is necessarily who they are because they say so, is ridiculous. It just doesn't make sense, and people know that that's not true. And whether that's people saying that they think they're gay or they're bi or whatever it is, or someone saying that they're a boy or a girl, and people, and we know that people retrans or detransition. People go through this and change their minds. They change their minds all the time. So, what you're saying is basically we are taking away adult authority. And it's not about Christianity. It's about adult authority. It's saying actually adults must not question a child's sense of self, right? And that is profoundly irresponsible, right? Profoundly irresponsible in terms of what a child is and what the role of adults are. It completely undermines the sense and the need to have adult authority and sensible adults, and most people recognise that. So I think that's there's a real possibility to raise a question about that. Just literally, simply at the level of adult authority, are we saying that when a 13-year-old child says that they're this, that, or whatever, then we just have to take the knee? Is that what we're doing as adults now? We're just saying, yes, we relinquish any thought, regardless of your circumstances, regardless of whether you've got mental health problems, whether you're self-harming, whatever it is that you've got going on in your life and all the other problems, we'll just ignore all of that and just say, yes, yes, child, we will bend down to this will, which might change in a few weeks' time. So what happened to that innate sense of self? It's crazy.
Yes, I'd agree with that. What we are dealing with at present is that there is this very strong push to drive children to believe that they are inherently, innately one of these large range of identities. And that involves, and it is intensely sexual and sexualized, it involves strongly encouraging them to follow all of their desires and to start to keep looking inside them and saying, how do I feel today? And what do I feel about this? What do I feel about that? That's incredibly damaging, but it's happening because of it's a religious conviction that the self is effectively has a divine authority, and is we have to kind of bow down to the self, as Stuart has just said, and we bow down to the children, say, well, your self is king. Now that is a terrible thing that is being said to children. But what this law would do is it effectively then surrounds that with a kind of with the kind of blasphemy laws, the phrase that you used, Simon, earlier on, that basically it prevents any kind of criticism of those who push forward this religious devotion to the self, and more kind of drastically, it prevents any attempt to help children to actually think about themselves in a much more rounded and healthy way, by saying to them, actually, what you are is not something that bubbles up from inside you. What you are is something that's been given to you in your birth, in your biology, and by the God who made you. And that gives a far more solid sense of who you are, because, well, that's true. We are, what we are is not something that we create. Things don't create themselves. And what this is doing is it's like it really is like, kind of imagine the sort of front line in a battle where you turn the guns around and fire the wrong way. Huge damage is being done to children by this ideology of the self. And children really need protecting from it. And this would be a bit of legislation that would aim all the guns at those who are trying to help children while protecting those who are doing the most harm. And that is a really terrible thing.
So how do we mobilise people to speak up when this is such a toxic issue? Calvin, I don't know whether you would like to have a go at that question first.
Yeah, that's the difficult part, because people are self-protective for obvious reasons. The biggest issue I see is people say, well, when I get this next job, or when I get this next hurdle, I'll be in a better position to proclaim the truth. I'll be able to say things then. But that never ever comes, because once you get to the next position, there's always some other barrier or some other hurdle you have to overcome to be in a comfortable position. There is never a comfortable position to proclaim the truth. I think people need to remember that we are called to do that. And as a Christian, we should be unafraid of dying for the faith. We're not going to get killed for saying these things. We might get slightly cancelled or socially stigmatized, but surely the gospel is worth it.
Julie, what do you think about how we mobilise people to speak out sensibly on this issue?
I think it is really difficult, and I think one of the issues is that we're kind of got so far down the line on this, and this has been going on for such a long time, that people, it's a bit like the frog in the boiler, in the water, isn't it? That people can't quite believe that it's really as bad as it is. I think to realise it's as bad as it is, you kind of have to realise you've ignored it for quite a long time, which I think is quite a difficult position, particularly for parents. I think, I've been, campaigning about sex education and things for quite a long time now. But I think if you've gone through all of this and effectively probably not protected your children, that's quite a difficult place to suddenly think, oh my goodness, what have I done? What have I allowed to happen? But I think encouraging people and just helping people to realize that even whatever you can say, whatever you can do can make a difference. And if we all encourage each other and we all talk to each other, because I think more people than you realize are worried about this, and if you can get into the conversations, you do find people who are also concerned. And so if you can then find a group of you that can speak out, then that helps. And I think so I think the more we can speak out and the more we can mobilise people and encourage people to speak out, the better.
Matthew, you've been mobilising church leaders on this. What's your experience of that? How do you think we get people willing to speak out?
That is very much a big part of the thinking behind the Greater Love Declaration, which you mentioned kindly when you introduced me, which is a declaration of church ministers, which is really trying to help church ministers to do this. I think those who lead churches do have a particular obligation to, because lots of other people can lose their jobs if they speak out, but we won't. Hopefully, not yet anyway. But I think there is still a lot of fear and a lot of sense of kind of, but we're such a tiny minority that if we speak out, we're just going to cause endless trouble for ourselves, and we don't want to do that. And so by having a really clear declaration about why Christian sexual ethics are good and why it is loving and kind to teach them, and why there's something deeply unloving and cruel about gender ideology and sexuality ideology, is in that it is destructive of lives, and we want to speak positively about that. And if there's many people speaking together, currently we've got nearly 1,300 signatories. That's all people who are in church ministry. We've got loads of other people who've signed in support who aren't. But I think that's very significant, because it means we are in a situation now where we can say to the government very clearly, just like, do you understand what you're doing if you put this onto the statute book, that you are going to be criminalising really, really large numbers of normal Christians, normal Christian parents, normal Christian ministers? And if we stand together, I think that really, really helps. And that is, I think, a key thing that we need to do. But a big part of it as well is simply having the courage of our convictions. And what we want to encourage all Christians to do is, don't be ashamed of what we believe. I think we've had a long period where lots of Christians have felt slightly embarrassed, and the Pride movement has managed to present itself as being the ones who are the bearers of all righteousness, and anyone who opposes them is beyond the pale. And I think we need to be really willing to say, and to take the opportunity to say, that really isn't true. And one of the things that gender ideology has particularly done, or this is also really clear when you look at the kind of relationships and sex education materials in schools, is to actually demonstrate that it is far from the case. Deep damage is being done to, children in particular, but right across society by this. And let's be bold and say so publicly.
Stuart, you and I have been in the trenches for quite a few years now on a few different issues. The named person scheme in Scotland, the Scottish Government's hate crime legislation. And those are both issues where we started out in the minority with a very unpopular position, but we ended up winning the argument. What do you think is the key to winning the argument? And do you think that this is ultimately a winnable argument in Scotland and in the rest of the UK?
I think it's winnable with ordinary people. Unfortunately, ordinary people don't run anything, so that makes it difficult. I do think it's worth pointing out. I'd be interested to see what the LGB Alliance think about this, because I'm increasingly of the opinion to try and distinguish LGB from TQ and so on, because part of what this proposal as it stands means is that you essentially are patronizing gay people and gay adults, because you're saying that they can't know their own mind. Like they they can't possibly have a conversation with somebody about their sexuality. And that's like essentially you're saying gay people are like children. That you can't allow gay people to or trans people, trans adults, to have these conversations. So I would be interested to see what the certain gay groups think about that, because it's utterly condescending the way that this is being represented. I think there's if you can get other faith groups, so Muslims in particular, on board. I'm working with a group in Dundee at the minute now that's a kind of Muslims and Christians and Jews over the sex education issue. And this is partly because of the politically correct nature of the modern elites and how they categorize vulnerable groups. If you get some of these other faith groups on board, that becomes a bit of a problem for them, because are they being Islamophobic to question Muslim parents? So that would be interesting and possibly quite useful. And I'm setting up this thing called the Scottish Union for Education at the minute, which is something that's trying to link parents and teachers and grandparents and communities around the idea that essentially promoting the idea of proper education and recognizing that what's all of this stuff that's happening in schools is really nothing to do with schools. It shouldn't be their business that they're getting involved in all these different aspects of a person's life. And I think this is quite significant for teachers, because it means that teachers who know that a kid is autistic, for example, and going through all sorts of problems, and then suddenly adopt some sexuality or some transgender framework, and actually is entirely aware that this is kind of problematic, and that teacher then raises a question about this, or doesn't valorize this child, then they're committing a crime. I mean, that's are teachers' unions happy with that? Is that acceptable, that you, just by raising a question, you are a criminal? I think a lot of teachers will be very concerned about that. They should be. It's incredibly worrying that just having that conversation. So I think there is potential for creating connections, not just between faith groups, but with teachers and also with parents, grandparents. And there's already a kind of quite a significant level of concern being raised by various groups on Facebook and elsewhere, which is how we were able to have a successful conference in the first place last weekend around the idea of education, not indoctrination, which is, I think people can see that this is becoming a problem. So the more that we can kind of work on these different levels and promote these problems, I think the greater the potential is to actually have a proper collective backlash, because I always think it's got to come from the people. The people are meant to be represented. That's at least some pressure on these aloof, disconnected politicians. So perhaps we need to get back on the road again and start trying to talk to people in community centres and wherever else we can across Scotland.
Well, thank you all for giving of your time to speak with me today. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion, and so I'm so grateful to you for joining us. Thank you to you as well for joining us. If you would like to hear more from Stuart and Calvin and Julie and Matthew on this issue, then do follow the Let Us Pray campaign. But for now, thank you for joining us. Goodbye and God bless.